Hi, my name is Jessa Wines-Devine, and I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Specialist at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
And my name is Karen Galbraith. I'm the Training Projects Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape.
This webinar is just an introduction. It's the beginning of a conversation. There isn't a lot of research out there that talks about human trafficking specifically in older adults. So that's exactly kind of what this is. It's just informational. We're starting this and we are hoping to build on this conversation. So if anybody that is viewing this is, working in this field or is a survivor themselves or just has any kind of information or best practices that they would like to share with us regarding human trafficking of older adults, our contact information will be available at the end of the presentation.
So as Jessa mentioned, this is really the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface of the issue of human trafficking and how it might be impacting older adults that either we're working with or who we know in our personal lives. So today we're going to spend some time going through to talk about how to identify human trafficking and then to discuss the intersections that it has with sexual abuse and domestic violence. We're going to think about what might be the signs that we might see to indicate human trafficking of older adults. We'll discuss some of the differences of human trafficking, abuse, and exploitation, and also areas where those things overlap. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up by exploring what some best practices and resources and recommendations are if you happen to be working with older adults who have experienced human trafficking. So when we talk about abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, we often use these terms interchangeably. But depending upon the law or the context, they might have different meanings. So it's just really important that as you're thinking about these things, to keep in mind that depending on the system that you're working within or the definitions you're using, that while many times these terms are interchangeable, there are certain settings and situations where they may not be. And so just to be aware of that so that we're sure that when we're working with other professionals or working with survivors, that we're all on the same page. It's also important to note that neither Jessa nor I are attorneys, and so we will be talking about some laws and some different information that relate to perhaps the criminal side of human trafficking. Again, I just want to say we're not attorneys, and while we will talk about laws and things like that, if you have specific legal questions, we encourage you to either reach out to PCAR or PCADV to discuss these issues with our legal teams, or to reach out to an attorney maybe within your own program or your own community to discuss these issues.
So first we're going to start out with an overview of each of our respective subjects. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of coercive behavior used by one person to gain and maintain power and control over another in an intimate or former intimate relationship. So how does domestic violence look for older adults? So when we're talking about this, we're talking about intimate partner violence in later life. And what it is any physical, sexual, or psychological abuse of an older person. It can encompass neglect, abandonment, and financial exploitation. It can also be perpetrated by another person or an entity and can occur in any setting at home, in an institution, or in the community. And when we're talking about older adults, we're talking about individuals that are 60 years and older. We often hear the term elder abuse, which is the umbrella term that's often used for this age group. But we are specifically focusing on intimate partner violence in later life, so we're giving it the title that it deserves to have. But when we're talking about data collection or research, everything is kind of put under elder abuse where you age into it. So it's broader. So we don't have specific statistics for domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, but we do have broader elder abuse statistics. So roughly 5 million people each year are affected by elder abuse, and of those, 2/3 of them are women, and only 1 in 24 cases are reported to the proper authorities that do get reported. In fiscal year 17-18, PCADV, our program served 4,135 older adults.
And so just to sort of provide an overview of sexual assault and sexual violence, we really understand that sexual violence happens on a continuum. So there are a range of behaviors that sort of fall under the definition or under the umbrella of sexual violence, but that the thing we always want to keep in mind is that sexual violence and all forms of violence are really rooted in oppressions and sort of the idea that certain people are valued more than others, or that certain people have the right to treat others in a certain and very often negative sort of way. So when we're thinking about sexual violence and how that might intersect with older adults, we need to really think about the different biases that we might have about whether it's victims of sexual violence, biases we might have about older adults, or about sexuality in later life. And many of these things sort of overlap and compound each other so that it really leads to the fact that we don't identify these things very commonly, or that maybe we don't have proper interventions and systems in place to assist older adults who are being victimized in this way. So again, we want to remember that people can be targeted for any number of reasons, but we do know that when people are part of marginalized populations, they are more likely to experience sexual violence. And again, when those things overlap, so if we're thinking about, an older adult who may also be having cognitive issues or challenges with dementia or something like that, that those things can actually compound a person's risk. And we need to be mindful of these things so that we can be sure to be identifying them appropriately. So similar to intimate partner violence in later life, sexual assault in later life is vastly underreported. And this is for a number of reasons, not only because sexual violence is often defined in many different ways, whether it's in different research studies where they set the parameters differently, or where laws may vary from state to state, or how they're interpreted might vary. We also know that how older adult is defined is often changeable. So, Jessa mentioned earlier the parameter of ages 60 and up is how we would define older adulthood, but in maybe a given research study or something like that, they could set that age at a different point. And so sometimes it makes it really hard to compare the different statistics that are out there and to really get an accurate number. And that's all also assuming that these are things that are reported, which we know very often that they are not. What we do know, however, with the limited information that is available, is that the majority of older adults experience sexual violence that's been perpetrated by a family member or an intimate partner. And of those, the vast majority, upwards of 85%, will not report that. And the reasons, are similar to what we see for people in other life stages. There's feelings of shame and guilt and fear. Oftentimes there's dependence upon the abuser or dependence upon the institution where the abuse is taking place. For many older adults, a fear of reporting might include the fact that they don't want to have to leave their home, or to have assistive care brought in or something like that, or to have their competency questioned. And these barriers to reporting can be compounded if other issues such as dementia or physical disability or mental illness are present. And we know that in older adults, even when they choose to report or choose to disclose that abuse is happening to them, it's often dismissed as confusion or dementia, or it's, just not taken seriously, frankly, because of biases that people might have about adults who are in later life. Too often when reports are made, they're simply not acted upon. And we know that the most common types of offenders outside of family members and intimate partners, so like maybe within an institutional facility, the two most common types of offenders are employees or other residents, which again can create barriers if that older adult is dependent upon that facility or dependent upon those caregivers for their daily needs. We also know with older adults that there's a more significant risk of injury if they're being sexually abused in some way. So just due to the nature of aging, there may be a greater risk of broken bones, or maybe due to certain medications or something, more of a risk of blood loss if somebody's on blood thinners, or more likely to have injury due to thinner skin and bruising and things such as that. But we know that when it is reported to medical facilities, typically that evaluation is limited or insufficient. And we also know that there can be a lot of confusion for older adults and their family members or people that are caring for them about guardianship and who gets to make medical decisions for that person or on behalf of that person, or if the person is perfectly capable for making those decisions for themselves. There may be sort of genuine misunderstandings about the parameters of a power of attorney or guardianship, or sometimes those people use that as a way to silence the older adult or to control sort of how that report is made or how that investigation proceeds. And sometimes, as I said, this can be done very innocently and in an attempt to sort of protect that older adult from a process or maybe an invasive exam or something like that. And so people might withhold information in an effort to provide that protection. But what we have to remember is that too is a form of bias, and that older adults are perfectly capable of making decisions for themselves, and we need to allow them to do that, and as we would with any survivor. The other thing that's often comes up when working with older adults is recognizing that people of different generations very often use different types of language or euphemisms to talk about sex, body parts, sexual assault, and just to be mindful of that, to be sure that you're using the language that is used by that survivor, so that you're on the same page with what you're talking about, and so that you can fully understand each other and be sure that you understand what their wishes are for how to move forward.
So physical and sexual assaults or threats to commit them are the most apparent forms of domestic violence and sexual assault, and are usually the actions that allow others to become aware of the problem. However, regular use of other abusive behaviors by the abuser, when reinforced by one or more acts of physical violence, make up a larger system of abuse. Although physical assaults may occur only once or occasionally, they instill a threat of future violent attacks and allow the abuser to take control of the individual's life and circumstances. The power and control diagram is a particularly helpful tool in understanding the overall pattern of abusive and violent behaviors which are used by an abuser to establish and maintain control over their partners. Very often, one or more violent incidents are accompanied by an array of these other types of abuse. They're less easily identified, yet firmly establish a pattern of intimidation and control in the relationship. The outer rim of the wheel defines violence or the threat of violence that is presenting in the relationship. Each spoke of the wheel represents different tactics that abusers may use to achieve the goal or outcome, which is centered around these behaviors, which is power and control. So this wheel was influenced heavily by the original power and control wheel, but it was adapted by the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life to fit the needs of older survivors' experiences. So in addition to the tactics on the original wheel, many offenders can justify or minimize the abuse and deny that they're abusive. Perpetrators of abuse in later life may make comments like they're just too difficult to care for, or they abused me as a child, to try to blame the victim, or to minimize the abuse by stating that the victim bruises easily, or the injuries are an accident, or it's an incidental result of providing care. For instance, the reason that there's bruises on their arms is because I was helping them get up off the chair. Some of the tactics that can be used against individuals that are 60 and older can mimic those represented in the original wheel, but they differentiate in certain ways. So, for instance, for physical abuse, the abuser may restrain them, throw things, block doorways, force medications. And when I say that, I mean not benefiting the individual by saying like, hey, it's time to take your meds, if this is something that the older adult needs help with, but it's simply to render them comatose for all intents and purposes that would benefit the abusive partner or the abusive individual, as well as hiding walkers and chairs. For sexual abuse, sexually harming them during caregiving or toileting routines, forcing sex acts, or forcing them to watch pornography. For psychological abuse, gaslighting as a very large behavior here to make them doubt their own judgment or thinking, and publicly humiliate them as well. For in terms of emotional abuse, degrading and blaming and yelling and insulting the older adult, targeting their vulnerabilities, neglecting them, trying to deny them things that they need for daily living, like food, heat, medications, testosterone, or hormones, doesn't follow medical recommendations, or refuses to dress or dresses the older adult inappropriately, or even threatens to out the partner to the facility, family, or other caregivers. Abusers of those older adults can also destroy spiritual or traditional items of importance like icons, or refuse to allow the older adult to participate in rituals, or even be disrespectful of their cultural practices or values whenever making decisions on behalf of the older adult. They mislead family members regarding the condition of the older adult, excluding or denying access to family, using their privilege, so speaking for the older adult at financial and medical appointments and making all major decisions. And Karen kind of touched on this for individuals. Some of this may seem innocent, but I'm talking about those individuals that take advantage of this, that take advantage of their guardianship privileges, or that may not have that, legal privilege over the older adult, but, kind of speaking over them in a way that they maintain control of the situation. Threatens, so, threatening to leave or commit suicide, to put the older adult in an institution, to abuse or kill pets or even their livestock. And one of the largest that we see, in domestic violence relationships, as well as financial abuse. So when we're talking about financial exploitation in this circumstance, it means stealing money, titles or possessions, abusing or exploiting the power of attorney or guardianship. So this would include failure to use the vulnerable person's income and assets to provide the necessities required for that person's care. Oftentimes, folks are sedated, again with forced medication, and are locked either in their homes or in their living facilities while their assets are spent down with the mentality of liquidate, isolate, medicate. Legalized racketeering, and also benefits trafficking. And when we talk about that, we're talking about, food stamps, Social Security, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and then other fraud, including insurance, tax fraud, identity theft. Abusers that are, exploiting financially also withhold benefits. They can, partake or develop insurance scams. And then they can also hold the older adult hostage in order to use these benefits, or also use these items as a bargaining tool for coercion.
So thinking about the term exploitation, just in general, when we use this term, what we're talking about is the taking advantage of someone or their resources. And again, these things might be illegal, but might not fit the same legal definitions of trafficking, for example. So one example might be commercial sexual exploitation, which is another term for sex trafficking. They're the same things. They are both illegal and would be charged as potentially a trafficking crime. However, if we use a term like financial exploitation, that may not legally be the same thing as human trafficking. Now, it would quite possibly be illegal and charged as different types of crimes. But again, this is just to point out the fact that we use these terms interchangeably, and often very basically they mean the same thing, but depending on the setting, like for example in the legal setting, they might not mean exactly the same things there. So we just have to be mindful of that, so that we know that when we're having conversations with folks, we're clear about exactly what we're talking about and the limitations of those definitions. So some examples just from across the state that we've seen where people have been exploited, and the majority of these are related to financial exploitation. But, again, this can be charged as crimes such as fraud or racketeering. As Jessa mentioned, this could include benefits trafficking, unnecessary medical expenses. So, for example, if a doctor's office is taking advantage of an older adult by putting them through, many types of testing that are unnecessary for, so that they can reap the financial gain of that, prescribing medications that aren't necessary, hospitalizations that are unneeded. Again, these things are forms of exploitation, but will not, as we'll see here in a couple of slides, meeting the definition of human trafficking as it's defined through Act 105. Now, as we talk about exploitation, and again, using the term sort of generally to talk about taking advantage of another person or their resources, a lot of times people might make the assumption that being exploited financially, for example, might have a different impact on a person than being exploited sexually. And really what we have to remember is that anytime somebody is being taken advantage of or duped, they're going to have really powerful feelings of shame and guilt and embarrassment, maybe related to that crime, of feeling embarrassed that they trusted this person, or feeling that maybe they shouldn't, that they, for some reason, are to blame for what happened. Like maybe they shouldn't have responded to that phone call in that way, or responded to that email in quite the same way. And so, we're going to see very similar feelings of guilt and shame associated with these types of crimes. And we have to remember that it can be exceedingly damaging to anybody, but we know that it can up the chances of depression and anxiety in older adults. It can increase physical issues as well. So maybe exacerbate illness, or just sort of create that withdrawal that may be associated with depression or something, leads to a physical deterioration as well. It's also important to remember that if we are talking about a case of financial exploitation, if that older adult has lost a large amount of money, perhaps, or even maybe not a large amount of money, but enough that it's impactful to their life, you could be talking about somebody potentially losing their home, losing their ability to have in-home care provided, losing their ability to pay other types of bills and those sorts of things. And that can be, again, adding additional layers of trauma onto that person. And it's also, again, we've talked about how the vast majority of times, unfortunately, people are taken advantage of and harmed by those that they know and trust, whether it's individuals or institutions. And so there's that extra layer of betrayal that is felt by people that are taken advantage of, that can, compound many of the impacts we've already talked about in terms of, depression, anxiety, and sort of those harmful feelings that somebody might have that can really impact many aspects of their life.
So when we talk about human trafficking, it's important to realize what we mean. So how we talk about human trafficking matters. Trafficking, by definition, is when people profit from the exploitation of others through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Legally, this term has a different meaning. Act 105, which we will review a bit later, defines what trafficking is in terms of being prosecutable by law. So during this presentation, as we both mentioned ongoing, we're going to operate from this definition that you see on the screen in the context of exploitation and abuse. So human trafficking takes on a variety of forms and intersects with domestic violence, sexual violence in multiple ways. For example, if an individual is trafficked by an intimate partner, family member, or other member of the household, sexual violence and domestic violence also occur. Additionally, domestic and sexual violence at home may become a push factor that causes someone to become vulnerable to trafficking. Even our definitions of what domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking are, they overlap in terms of what is experienced in terms of violence and abuse. When a trafficker is exploiting an intimate partner or family member, the familial relationship itself may be used to perpetuate an exploitative power imbalance. In addition to shared experiences of abuse and manipulation, domestic and sexual violence is a demonstrated push factor, making individuals more vulnerable to trafficking.
So as promised, we're going to take a couple minutes here to sort of dig into what the law says about human trafficking and how the law defines it. So it wasn't until 2014, the summer of 2014, that Governor Corbett signed Act 105 into law. And prior to that time, human trafficking was not defined within the Pennsylvania Crimes Code. There were federal protections in place, but in terms of state law, there was nothing until 2014. So the one other thing I'd like to make clear, because I think it's been a point of confusion for some folks, particularly those who are maybe just starting to learn about trafficking, even though the word trafficking has the word traffic within it, it's important to note that human trafficking does not require a person to be transported in any way, shape, or form, that you don't have to cross state lines or international borders, that trafficking can occur right within somebody's home without them ever going anywhere. And so that has sometimes led to some confusion about what trafficking is and how it can be identified and defined. So just to be clear, under Pennsylvania law, there is no need for that person to have been transported anywhere. So within Act 105, sex trafficking is defined as a commercial sex act. And what that means is that if we talk about a commercial sex act, it means that the act is committed or done in exchange for financial gain. And so, again, it's a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or where the victim is a minor. Now, obviously, we're talking about older adults, so that last portion doesn't really apply, but it is important to note that maybe if you're working with younger people in other parts of your job or something like that, that if a victim is a minor, there is no requirement for force, fraud, or coercion. But when we're talking about adults, force might mean physical force or threat of force. So might be physical violence that's perpetrated against someone, or again, a threat of physical violence. Fraud would be just the misrepresentation or the lies that traffickers might tell in order to make somebody feel as though they either have to participate in this or that they just feel compelled to participate, maybe because of false promises that have been made or something like that. And then lastly, coercion is when somebody feels maybe more for the psychological reasons or psychological threats that are made to that person that they need to engage or do this, or that there's going to be some threat of harm to them or to their family members, or maybe, a threat that they will lose something that is of value to them if they don't do what the trafficker is asking them to do. And then Act 105 also talks about labor trafficking, and this is labor that would be attained by the use of threat of serious harm, physical restraint, or abuse of legal processes. So again, we're talking about people that are being forced to engage in commercial sex or being forced to engage in labor practices. That is not by choice. That is by force, fraud, or coercion, threat of harm, physical restraint, or manipulation of legal processes. So an example of that might be a threat to engage immigration authorities or something. If you have an older adult who perhaps is new to the country or something like that, even if they're here legally and are documented and all those kinds of things, just sort of the threat of that report can often be enough to cause someone to feel like they don't have a choice. Or it could be threats against family members and things like that. So that's an example of how a trafficker might abuse a legal process. Or again, we talked about sort of that misrepresentation of somebody's power of guardianship or legal authority over another individual. If somebody's intentionally doing that to make that older adult feel as though they have no choice, that could be another form of abuse of a legal process, for example. So Act 105, as we've mentioned, it aids in the prosecution of these crimes because it provides those statewide legal definitions. And it also it identifies certain acts and means that traffickers might use in terms of recruiting people or exploiting them, so that they can be held accountable for those things as well. Act 105 aims to prevent trafficking by sort of building and strengthening services and programs for survivors. And that can include things like medical services and mental health services, housing options, providing for temporary and permanent housing placement, could support legal and immigration services, provide employment, education, and training for survivors. It also aims to increase public awareness and to provide additional training for first responders who would be, assisting survivors in their healing and to access services, and that could include legal services and that sort of thing. Act 105 also aims to protect survivors by helping to vacate prior convictions. So if a person has prior convictions for prostitution, for example, and now under Act 105, those prior convictions that were associated with their trafficking can be vacated so that is no longer on their record, so that they can sort of be free of the stigma of that's associated with the prostitution, because Act 105 recognizes that that's actually part of their victimization. Act 105 also provides diversionary programs, confidential case management for survivors, and then also offers the opportunity for survivors to seek civil remedies in certain cases. And that would allow people to either sue their trafficker or potentially sue businesses or institutions that sort of were complicit in that trafficking. So it could be a hotel that turned a blind eye, or an institution that turned a blind eye to trafficking that they knew was occurring within their business or facility.
So when we're talking about individuals, it's important to recognize that they're all going to have their own reactions and needs in the wake of their victimization. However, there are some common threads. So for instance, they have complex, profound needs, sometimes even more so in human trafficking cases, just because of the multi-layers of trauma and the historical trauma that comes along with a prolonged victimization. Language or cultural barriers, it can be hard to identify. It can be hard to identify domestic violence. It can be hard to identify sexual assault. It can also be hard to identify human trafficking.
And Jess, if I can jump in just on that one real quickly, it's not only hard for people to identify it from the outside, but I think very often it's even difficult for survivors to identify their own experiences and to sort of define them within these terms.
Absolutely. Oftentimes, in all three of these realms, victims are blamed for the behavior. Their behavior is criminalized. Oftentimes, survivors are suspicious of authorities. Typically the criminal justice system, of law enforcement, of social services, due to their not trauma-informed responses, or their inability to be responsive to the needs of folks. They're often afraid of their abusers, and not even just afraid, but they love them. For older adults, it's their children, it's their grandchildren. They love them. They don't want to see them getting in trouble, or they don't want them to go away. So all of those feelings, that Karen had mentioned before about, of guilt, and, they're dedicated to them, they love them. Also, lack of access to important documents, and being isolated from personal and community supports. So how does this look for older adults? It's important to understand the intersection between domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, because it's extremely important for raising awareness of the realities of what survivors and victims face, especially when it's compounded by the unique needs and experiences of those who are 60 and older. Additionally, recognizing the interconnected nature of these phenomena may allow service providers to better their support for older adult survivors who may have been subjected to sexual assault, domestic violence, and trafficking. Whenever we're talking about older adults in the realm of trafficking and how it kind of overlaps with domestic violence and sexual assault, we need to think about the trafficking and exploitation that may be happening around adults as well. So in-home care providers, the care facilities, or the agencies or people who provide domestic work around the older adult, they may be trafficked, or even like lawn maintenance folks. But we also need to remember that older adults may be survivors of human trafficking. They may be, survivors and just finding this word for this thing that they've lived and experienced, throughout their life, either as labor or sex trafficking, so that now we can help kind of navigate their healing through that process by giving it a name and, allowing them to heal in the way that they need to. So some unique considerations whenever we're talking about older adults. There's typically perception of less agency. And all of it comes down to ageism. The way that we think about older adults, the way that we talk about older adults, even just the title of this training maybe has caught a lot of folks off guard, thinking like, oh, older adults and trafficking, or older adults and, and being a sexual being, or older adults even having a romantic relationship, may not be something that even we as advocates can't comprehend sometimes. And that, again, speaks to the ageism that is so prominent and prevalent in our society. So this is something that, puts them at a disadvantage whenever we're talking about victimization, because they aren't taken seriously, or it's often written off. And it's also, allowing abusers to take advantage of that as well. Older adults are at a greater vulnerability because they're more likely to engage in systems. So they're at the potential for higher injury. Often these folks can have more cognitive issues, more mental health, are on more medications, whether that be needed or kind of forced. There are more barriers for reporting for older adults. And also the venues where they frequent are much different.
So when we think about traffickers, we have to remember that traffickers are incredibly manipulative and will aim to exploit a victim's vulnerabilities. And so, we have on our slide the wolf in sheep's clothing. And we have to remember that traffickers are really adept at grooming not only their victims, but the people around their victims as well. So, their goal is to go unnoticed. Their goal is to be trusted so that they can get away with the abuse and exploitation that they are perpetrating against that older adult. They target people that they know are less likely to be believed. They target people that they know are less likely to have, as many connections, for example. So when we talk about older adults, as we've said, they can very often be dismissed not only because of their age, but because of perceptions about dementia or perceptions about the impact that their medications may be having on them. And oftentimes medications can have very real effects on older adults, and traffickers are aware of that and they take advantage of that. We do know that older adults with disabilities or medical dependency are at the greatest risk because they're in contact oftentimes with even more caregivers, and so as their interaction with people increases, the risk increases. We're talking about needing help with very intimate types of care. And in those situations, those lines then are more easily crossed, unfortunately, if people that are providing that care are not, do not have good intent. We also know that older adults, like people of all ages, can struggle with alcohol and drug addiction, which is something else that can make reporting difficult. It can also make manipulation easier for traffickers, frankly, because they can use that addiction to control their victims, unfortunately. So again, we just have to remember that these forms of violence are rooted in oppression. And so when we're thinking about people that are maybe more marginalized within our society and how those oppressions can intersect, we know that traffickers are aware of these things as well, and they will take advantage of that. Unfortunately, I wish that we could identify traffickers just by looking at them, but we can't, because truly they are the wolves in sheep's clothing. They often, present in, ways they can be very charming, very loving, very friendly, but unfortunately, have this dark side where they're harming others. And we know that traffickers can be people that are known and trusted to that older adult, could be children or grandchildren, family members. Those people that we should be able to trust the most very often are the ones that cause great harm. Partners of that older adult, so whether it's a lifelong partner or whether it's somebody that's new to their life, in more recent history, partners can certainly be traffickers and abusers. Caregivers, so that could be somebody within a care facility, or that could be somebody that's providing in-home care. And again, that could be somebody that's sort of hired as a professional to do that, or it could be somebody that's, sort of more of a lay caregiver that's not acting in a professional role necessarily. It could be an employer, so somebody, if that older adult is in the workplace or something like that, it could be an employer that's exploiting them, either again for labor trafficking or sex trafficking. It could be somebody that's within the facilities where that older adult is residing, or within, businesses or organizations where that person is going to, maybe even seek entertainment or seek, have a social outlet or something like that. Truly, a trafficker could be anyone. And this is true, again, no matter what stage of life somebody is in. Again, traffickers are really adept at identifying vulnerabilities, and in many cases, unfortunately, they seek out older adults because they might have greater access and sort of more societal protection because of the biases that we have about older adults and their agency and that sort of thing.
And it's also important to note that when we're talking about who the traffickers are, we can also be looking for recruiters. There are also recruiters that are working for the traffickers who recognize these intersections and the vulnerabilities and the folks that kind of live in those little pockets of, intersections and understand the how to find them and who they are and where to go to find these folks. So, recruiters are often planted in these places as well.
So, how we respond to whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking of older adults, it really matters because we know obviously that it's important to utilize a trauma-informed, victim-centered approach, but there are many other things that go into this as well. So we need to continue to advocate for people to recognize that this is in fact an issue, because again, people don't like to think about these issues in general, but particularly when we talk about older adults. I think people have a natural inclination, or again, because of sort of our biases, we feel a need and a want to protect older adults, but we have to recognize their agency and recognize our own biases that maybe get in the way of recognizing these crimes that are being perpetrated against them. And so part of how we can do that is not only educate ourselves and become aware of our own biases and assumptions that we might be making, but also to partner with organizations like maybe your area agency on aging and other older adult advocacy organizations or legal organizations. So we can partner with them to invite them to be on our response teams, whether it's a sexual assault response team, domestic violence response team, human trafficking response team. We can set up cross-training with these organizations, not only so we can learn more about the work that they're doing and learn more about working with older adults in general, but so that they can also learn about the work that we're doing and how we can be partnering to provide better care and better services for older adults. Also, the other thing that does is it helps us to be able to provide those warm handoffs, in times when maybe we need to make a referral for someone, or we want to be educating a survivor about what all their options within the community are. If we know these organizations and we can recommend that specific staff person who we know will give them the warm response that they deserve, that way we can be supporting survivors in a more effective way as well. It's also important to increase those relationships because older adults aren't going to be frequenting the same places as maybe adolescents or people in sort of their middle age years. And so making sure that we're finding out and targeting our outreach and our efforts in ways that are going to be most effective and most responsive to those older adults is important. Sometimes if maybe you're new to working with older adults, or this is an area that your organization is just beginning to think about and beginning to want to really dig into and do some meaningful work, you may not have had to think about this before. So partnering with those organizations to find out where you can go to do meaningful engagement would be really important.
So confidentiality and mandated reporting. So the Adult Protective Services Act of 2010 requires employees and administrators of facilities to report abuse committed against certain individuals between the ages of 18 and 59. Mandated reporters include any employee or administrator who has reasonable cause to suspect a recipient is a victim of abuse or neglect, or any employee or administrator who has reasonable cause to believe a recipient is the victim of sexual abuse, serious injury, or serious bodily injury, or that a death is suspicious. The key word in this definition is facilities. The term facility includes, but is not limited to, any organization or group of people that uses public funds and is paid in part to provide care and support to adults in a licensed or unlicensed setting. A domestic violence or sexual assault program cannot be deemed a facility if the services it provides do not meet the definition of care and support, which the Older Adult Protective Services Act, or OPSA Act, defines care as being services provided to meet the needs of one's personal care and health care. Therefore, domestic violence and sexual assault programs are not considered facilities as per the APS Act, and program staff and volunteers are not required under law to report suspected abuse of older adults. However, we are mandated to report under the Child Abuse Act. So we're mandated reporters for child abuse, but not mandated reporters for older adults.
And again, this can cause some confusion, especially if you're working with people that are maybe within systems and they are mandated reporters. Again, we have to remember that in our line of work as advocates in sexual assault and domestic violence programs, our confidentiality and privilege is there in order to protect that survivor. And it is their confidentiality that we're protecting. And so we can only breach that if we are given their consent to do so. And again, sometimes people think out of a desire to be helpful or protective that they think maybe they should be making a report even though they're not mandated to do so. And we just want to be clear that that is a breach of confidentiality if that is done without the express consent of that adult, because they have the right to decide what happens next, and they have the right to understand their options and make whatever choice feels right and safe to them at that time.
And as Karen said, it's important to recognize that when we're working within systems for others that are mandated reporters of older adults, and we're making warm referrals, to make sure to communicate that with the survivor that you're working with, to let them know that kind of your absolute confidentiality kind of lives here within our program. If when we make this referral, if you're comfortable and this is the route you want to go, to understand that they are mandated reporters and help them understand what that means and what that will look like afterwards.
And again, I just want to give the disclaimer that neither Jessa nor I are attorneys, and our legal services both here at PCADV and PCAR are willing to talk with you more about this if you guys have any questions related to mandated reporting and what your legal obligations are.
So some best practices. Again, as we said, there's not much research out there. So what we want is to continue this conversation until we can start, developing some concrete ways to collect data, to have resources specific to older adults and trafficking. So in the meantime, in order to, kind of work together, again, connect with your local aging office, reach out and set up cross trainings, referral processes. So whenever you're working with a survivor that's seeking, domestic violence or sexual assault services that may also need something beyond our scope, that you can partner together so you don't just refer and lose them. And same for them, if they have somebody that's presenting with domestic violence in their either history or current or sexual assault that occurred, that they can make a referral to us, and then we can both be working with the client as a whole. Advocacy, education, and outreach. As Karen said, it's important to start looking out to where we're doing our outreach and focus on places. So really seek out these niche places that this population frequents. So think outside of the box. Look at dentist office, podiatrists, chiropractors, kind of places, medical places that are outside of the ER or the typical hospital or doctor's office. Looking into, senior centers, where folks go for entertainment. If there's a diner in your community that's frequented by older adults, even having them put up a flyer for your agency.
And I think sometimes just some very simple things, or to think about the graphics that are being used on, flyers or brochures or things that you have that make them more representative of sort of the multiple populations that you're trying to reach out to. So again, remembering that many older adults are frequenting the same places as adolescents and younger adults and things like that. But, really identifying where you want to be doing that meaningful engagement, how you want to be doing that, and making sure that whatever the materials are, the language you're using is appropriate for, the folks you're trying to reach.
And in terms of referrals, know your capacity, work together, know your local resources, and be able to refer and collaborate with folks in your community.
I think too, we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar a little bit that this is sort of the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and our coalitions and some of our partners at the state level are really starting to dig into this. So the hope is that not only our field starting to talk about older adults and how they might be impacted not only by sexual violence and domestic violence, but also by human trafficking, that this is going to be a new conversation in your community with your community partners as well. And so as you can be sort of hitting the ground running together on these issues, that's just how much more effective we will all be in making sure that survivors of these types of crimes and this type of exploitation and trafficking, just making sure that we're all providing them the best services that they need. So we also wanted to provide for all of you the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Again, this should only be used with the permission of a survivor, because that is, we have to maintain our confidentiality and protect their confidentiality. But also, it's important to note that you may, outside the scope of your work and outside of, working directly with survivors or something, see things in your community happening that are concerning to you. And so this is a hotline, that is a resource to all of you if you have questions or things that are concerning to you. But again, this should only be used either with the express consent of the survivor or not in relationship with survivors that you're working with.
So if anybody has any questions about any of the materials that we kind of reviewed today, or would like to share, your own resources or experiences, this is our contact information. We have our phone numbers, our addresses, and our emails. Please reach out. Again, this is a conversation that we are looking forward to building on.
We welcome hearing from you, because we know that you're out in the field and many of you are already doing amazing work with older adults and are already doing amazing work when it comes to responding to human trafficking in your communities. And we love to hear from you, because as we learn what great things are happening throughout the state, we can sort of magnify that and share your expertise and experiences, not only with others within our fields, but to our allied professional partners that we're all working with at the state and local level. So please share your experiences and expertise with us so that we can be learning from you and sharing your good work throughout the state.
Thank you so much for watching with us today. Hope we will hear from you soon.